Lynae's attributes have been revealed. Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So, recently Kuro has been slowly rolling out their promotional material for Wuthering Waves 3.0, and with that, we've gotten the drips for Lynae and Morn. And I think they both look fantastic. I am very excited for both characters. I am looking forward to seeing more of them. However, I had very little to go off of when it came to what they could potentially do, because first of all, they are brand new 3.0 characters, so there's literally no telling what these units are gonna do, and secondly, there wouldn't have been any point in saying anything about them whenever their drips first came out, because obviously I knew that we were going to get their attribute reveals not long after. So now we're here, now we have the attributes, so now we can actually try to have some kind of discussion in regards to what these units might end up doing, with this video focusing on Lynae. Now, to be honest, we obviously still don't really have much to go on, because while we do have something to work with now, it's still very little information in the grand scheme of things. There isn't much that we can tell from being a pistols user, and there isn't much that we can tell from a character just being Spectro, but we can at least make some guesses and think about what is missing in the meta or what would be a fun addition to the meta. So, what I will say is that Chisa did recently come out, and I wouldn't be surprised if Kuro wanted to make another negative status DPS so that Chisa could have an upscale in value, because as it currently stands, Chisa is just a little bit of an upgrade for Cardathea with her signature weapon, and otherwise isn't really that crazy. So I do think that in 3.x, we will eventually get a new negative status DPS so that Chisa can be upped in value. However, I'm not particularly sure if that's going to be happening anytime soon. I also think it will be a little bit weird to open the High Roy with a negative status DPS, because I assume that Kuro is going to prefer having a more accessible character to introduce the region with, because after all, a lot of new players are going to be joining during 3.0, as I imagine Kuro is going to be marketing a lot and really pushing the High Roy. So, with that in mind, I do think that if she ends up being a DPS, she's probably going to be on the more accessible side. I'm not particularly sure what they're going to come up with, because like I said, 3.0 is likely just going to throw us some insane new mechanic that none of us could really predict. And perhaps they decide to introduce that with Lynae, though I should note that negative statuses didn't really get much exposure until Phoebe came out in 2.1 in Renacita, so there is also a chance that she could just end up being a bulk standard hypercarry, even if she does end up being a DPS, and if she's a support, there are a couple of angles they could go, because we're getting more specific supports these days, and it's not really as simple as this character has this element, so they are going to support this element. Because of Cho Yuen, he is mostly good for echo skill damage characters, and then with Yuno, she is good for the entire heavy attack archetype. So with Lynae, I would assume that if they make her a support, she is likely going to be good for a general archetype. I don't think we're ever really going to get a shorekeeper type support ever again, if not for a very long time. But if they were going to do that type of thing again and make a universal support, then I suppose now would be the time, because it's the release of a brand new region. We don't have any HP scaling buffers in the game yet, but I don't really think they would make an HP buffer, because Cardathea is the only character that would benefit from that. She recently got a teammate with Chisa, and upscaling Cardathea will be a bit of a random choice, considering that she's plenty strong already, and they're probably just going to want to focus on the new region instead. So I'm personally going to make the assumption that Lynae is going to be a DPS from here on. She could be a support, and if we want to make the assumption that maybe she does buff Spectro and Outro, maybe she could work with Jinji, but I just don't really think that's going to be the case. I think that ship sailed a long time ago. But I think that if this is going to be the focused character of 3.0, then I personally think she's going to be a main DPS. Something I would like to point out is that usually, typically speaking, assuming that she's an attack scaler, she's actually going to be able to likely use Static Mist quite well. The reason I'm saying this is because both Galbrena and Carlotta ended up being pretty good Static Mist users. It just ends up being a thing where all 5-star pistols users just kind of end up doing really nicely on Static Mist. I don't really think that Lynae is going to be any different. Mostly just because Static Mist is a really good standard weapon, so if she's able to utilize that nicely, then great, we're in luck. If she ends up scaling off of something else, it's probably not going to be as good for her. Or if they end up giving her kit this really hyper-specific mechanic that's going to be new in 3.0, and then her signature weapon is really going to buff that up, thus making it way better than Static Mist, but I'm personally not sure if they're going to do that. However, one thing that I will add is that if she does end up being a support, well, Static Mist is just a really good supportive weapon in general because it can provide an attack buff. And as it currently stands, most resonators in the game scale off of attack, so because of that, it would end up being pretty useful for a vast majority of characters in the game, and I assume that whatever she would end up buffing would end up being able to leverage that. However, like I said, I personally think she's going to be the DPS of the patch, If there's going to be a support in this patch, I think it's going to be Morn, because she was the second revealed character, and usually, literally look back at all of Wuthering Waves' banner histories, each patch that had 2 limited 5 stars in it, usually the first one was a DPS, the second one was a support, of some variety. I don't see why they would break that structure now. And another thing that I'd like to point out that I'm decently confident in, even with the limited information that we have, is that I think that she's probably going to end up being a pretty good DPS throughout the entire Lynae patch, simply because that's what happened with Carlotta. I do think that they're just going to make this that character where you can pick her up at pretty much any time and she's going to be reliable, because she is the introductory character into Lynae. They're likely going to want that anchor character that, you know, you can easily pick her up, you can easily invest in her, and it's pretty easy to get into the game. She is likely going to inherently be designed with new players in mind because she is releasing during such a big patch. And I think that's a very good thing. I think it would be very weird if they ended up making her quite restrictive. Another thing is that if she did end up being a Spectro Frazzle DPS, because that's what she would end up being if she was a negative status DPS, that would just boost Phoebe's meta value again. Right now, you pretty much only get Phoebe if you're a Zani main, but if they did make Phoebe more valuable, that would be a little bit strange because a rerun is already passed. Then again, this is Kuro Games we're talking about, and they are very much willing to rerun a character not very long after they've appeared on banners just because they're good with the on-banner character, and I think that's a decent way of doing things. At least it means that if she does end up being necessary, she will be available to pick up. But once again, I don't think they would make a brand new premier character of the new region end up being a negative status DPS, simply because that's just not that accessible to new players. And another thing is that I don't really think they're going to want to highlight the old Renacita mechanic in a brand new region. I do think we're going to get more negative status characters, unless they plan to just never boost up Chisa. After all, even Roshia did end up getting a new team. She did kind of get kicked out of it immediately afterwards by Choyuan, but the point stands that she did at least get a new option. But I personally expect them to reserve that for later down the line, because they're going to want to emphasize the Lynae mechanics. So all around, I think that if you're newer, look out for this character, keep your eyes peeled for her, because I do think that she's going to end up being a good investment. But we're just gonna have to wait. The thing is with Kuro Games is that they are incredibly unpredictable. I can make these statements and I can say, I think she's gonna end up being good, I think that they're likely to make her more accessible, but I don't particularly have any faith in that because Kuro Games is so unpredictable and they could easily come out swinging with something that literally none of us could have ever predicted, which honestly never change Kuro Games. More often than not, it ends up resulting in something cool. But in Lynae's case, I do think that at the very least, she is going to end up being good. That is a bit of a nothing burger statement, to be honest, though, because think about it like this. Oh, a Wuthering Waves DPS is going to be good. What a shocker! They usually are, especially on release. So that in of itself isn't really riveting information. She's obviously going to be good. I don't really think Wuthering Waves has ever released a main DPS character and they felt really bad to play on launch, or they were really bad in general. That just doesn't really happen. We've had underwhelming supports before, like Roshia and Chisa, but we've never really had an underwhelming DPS. And maybe DPSs have fallen off over time, like Shangli Yao, but not until a lot of time has passed. So, if she does end up being a DPS, she is likely to end up being good. And if she is a support, well, we're just gonna have to wait and see what she supports, because there are very much cases in which Kuro releases dedicated supports for certain niches or certain characters, and they end up being pretty skippable. So, like I said, it's really just gonna be up to time, and we will simply have to wait and see. However, one thing that I would like to add, Spectro is not a bad choice for her. Usually Kuro Games is a little bit silly with the elements, which I'm gonna get into when I talk about Morn. However, at least with Lynae, I think Spectro suits her. I don't really think that there was any other element that she overwhelmingly had to be. I think another Spectro character is perfectly fine. We haven't had one since Zani, I believe. We do have a pretty decent Spectro roster, but I won't say no to another Spectro character. I mean, I think we're long overdue for a Glacio, to be perfectly honest with you, which I'm going to get into in the Morn video. But at least with Lynae, I think this is a perfectly fine set of attributes. The only thing that I can say of any real substance right now, farm your pistol materials if you're interested in her, and another thing is try and get Static Mist if you don't have it already, or if you've just got it lying around and you haven't fully leveled it or touched it at all, then now is a good time to level it up, because there is a chance that it's going to be good on her, and even if it's not good on her, well then at least you're going to have a weapon for her to use, because at least the standard weapons are competent on most characters. I'm looking forward to her. I'm interested in seeing what they're going to do here. I think that it's likely she's going to end up being a great pull. Is she going to be a must pull? Well, I literally cannot say that right now because I don't know, but I can at least deduce if she is anything similar to Carlotta, and if she has similar release circumstances to Carlotta, she is likely going to be a good investment for people that don't really have a lot of Astrites and they want to get into the game, or maybe they just want to get back into the game, something along those lines. She'll probably be accessible simply because she's going to be releasing during such a premiere patch, but I can't say anything for certain. This is literally all just me thinking based on past events. And they could do something entirely new, which, considering that it's Kuro Games we're talking about here, that is what I'm expecting. But either way, hopefully this video is able to feed you some food for thought in regards to what Lynae might end up doing. This has been Juice, signing out. And friendly reminder that the best thing about Lynae is a little blue cube guy. I love that. I love that she has a little creature just hanging on her coat. That's really funny.